If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we continue to unravel the mysteries behind the origins, motives, and cultures of the 16 ghostly guilds in the world of darkness. This episode will focus on the Spooks Guild and their Outrage Arcanos. Curious, dear explorer, what do you think of the Arcani we have discussed thus far? Each of them fit their appropriate guild, don't you think? Whilst some are more frightening than others and some are exceptionally violent, you have to admit that each one has some level of class to them and that their respective guilds treasure with an almost religious-like appreciation. Of course, that doesn't speak for all the guilds. Some just want to break things and cause as much violence as possible. If that sounds like your sort of thing, then may I gesture you towards the Outrage Arcanos developed by the Spooks Guild, where you indeed can cause your own unique brand of outrage. No, I will never tire of these awful puns. But regarding the Arcani itself, Outrage is one of the several Arcanos that can affect the living world, the Skinlands. Unlike other Arcani, all of the Outrage arts are violent or physical in some capacity, as are its practitioners. It is said that a lot of non-verbal communication is used to focus one energies properly, by which I mean there's an awful lot of grunting and moaning involved. This is understandable, as any heavy work needs a bit more oomph. The Haunters claim Outrage and its fancier younger cousin, Pandemonium, exist as a manifestation of the wielding, as we touched upon when we were talking about the Haunters a couple of weeks ago. Of course, we know Outrage came first, which would probably make many of the elder members of the Spooks Guild very happy indeed. Pandemonium relies on perceptual and psychological manipulation, whilst Outrage taps into the physical malleability of the underworld, though its powers can affect both Skin and Shadowlands. You are probably thinking this is the Arcanos of choice for thugs and criminals, which certainly does have some truth in there, but to dismiss it as such is actually doing the Outrage Arcanos a disservice. Consider for a moment that what many have done with anger as their motivator, particularly in times of stress and peril. One can act with alarming precision and even subtlety. Outrage is frequently used to clear buildings of troublesome quick mortals. They also serve as the muscle of the Shadowlands, as their abilities can be immensely powerful with training. Many powerful spooks serve in Stygia's armies as long as they keep their antics in the Shadowlands down to a bare minimum. Some spooks also work with artificers to create relics. We've also found some cases where some spooks are pertaining to the guild, or those just are well versed with Outrage, are inherently able to leap extraordinary distances in the Shadowlands and Underworld, or change directions flowing in the Tempest. Some sources claim this can work outside of these places as well. Of course, there are so many wraiths who are so well versed with Outrage, or rather wish to refine their master of dark emotions in this manner. Many just wish to polarize things into oblivion, which I mean rather literally, as one art allows the spooks to do, well, just that, which feeds their shadows with plenty of angst. It has been debated amongst ghost hunters and spook guild members alike that this angst doesn't come from any guilt or emotional baggage, but a connection from the weird, wild, and oblivion itself. This theory states that a spook that uses Outrage channels itself through the wielding and into a spook that uses Outrage primarily in its destructive phase. Potential dancing with oblivion and feeding the shadow with angst are not the only perils of the Arcanos, as mishaps, for lack of a better phrase, can affect wrong items or individuals, including themselves. The raw physicality of Outrage affects the wraiths in similar fashions. Broad shoulders, massive chests, and surly expressions on their visage are all identifiers of the spooks. They tend to have oddly knotted, powerful muscle groups and misshapen looks. This obviously becomes more obscene with more experienced Outrage users as they become hulking beefcakes. You know the sort of steroid-induced individuals I speak of. Spooks are walking cinder blocks which which some tried to hide by manifesting looser clothing or even obtaining relics, both of which are difficult to do and come across. In addition, many within the Spooks Guild carry around a weapon, usually blunt in the description, be it a crowbar or a finely made nudry special. Many also carry guns aplenty. Despite these somewhat ominous criminal tones we are referring to, the Spooks Guild claims to have a more noble point of origin. Well, it depends on what you think of the likes of Odysseus, Orpheus, Gilgamesh, and other similar figures of Greek and Rome legend that freely travelled between the Shadow and Skinlands. The Spooks claimed these figures of old, broke the shroud via some use of outrage, and as such are said to be the forerunners of spooks and thus celebrated in life and death, which obviously generated plenty of pathos. When the sundering took place, the early spooks were unable to travel to the Skinlands as freely and began their best known practice known as pathos running, bottling up excess pathos they collected and selling it to on and so forth, as and when they needed. These groups of spooks were called the Nepenthians, which we will explore in fuller detail later on alongside other Spook Guild factions. Taking up other activities, a group of spooks of the First Great Maelstrom, known as the Dollar Bra, offered themselves to Charon as mercenaries to push back the spectres that attack Stygia and the Isle of Sorrows. We have been unable to find the names of any of these rapes to confirm this, but I suspect Charon or the hierarchy didn't want to admit they got outside help from particularly infamous sources. The hierarchy did not require their services or the aid of the Nepenthians after the formation of Charon's empire, which caused an ugly conflict between the veterans of the Old War and those that collected and sold bottled pathos. At the time, they saw no real reason to work together. That was until the Haunters Guild called upon the first conclave during the Dark Ages and invited them to join. Not wanting to take any more casualties, both factions of the soon-to-be Spooks Guild joined, getting their first taste of the guild's structure and organization as a whole. During this time, many spooks found new business in the protecting of fetters and watching over the many mortal families who obsessed about reaching heaven when they passed into the afterlife, in addition to any wraith who wished for their family's safety. This particular branch of the spooks were called the Dullians. While some still show animosity, the Haunters and Spooks are bosom buddies once more. The first conclave was not all constructive though, as those that would form the Spooks Guild did not think their interests were taken into account. This was partly true, as many Haunters thought outrage was a dead art, as I explained to you a couple of weeks ago. What I avoided telling you previously was the one that actioned this leave. It was a Ned Riddle, who has been credited to be the first to voice the concern of these spooks. It was Riddle that named this group the Spooks, a name many of the Haunters had been calling them under their breath, referring to how unrefined the Haunters believed the Spooks' arts were. So, the Spooks left, taking their secrets of outrage with them, and the three factions, Dullians, Dolabra, and Nepenthians, formed the Spooks Guild, collectively known as the Three Leagues. We also know through our conversation regarding the Haunters, they went to great lengths to make the spooks feel they needed them, but I deliberately didn't further explain that for the ease of conversational flow. One of these smear campaigns was a particularly infamous one known as the Village Incident, or simply the Incident, where an unimportant circle made their haunts on the outskirts of a village by some byway that was captured by a hierarchy patrol. The hierarchy did not know of this new guild, assuming these spooks were just a new type of spectres. The little that survived, both the village itself and Wraith, was sold to reapers to do as they please. The Haunters would use this slander as their main weapon, spreading it to the other guilds, garnering the spooks a horrible reputation. Ned Riddle and the Spooks had to fight back when all they wanted to do was form a guild in peace. They eventually reached out to the Artificers to explain their story and who would agree would help them, providing the Spooks lent their support to the Artificers when they needed it. With the seal of approval, as it were, the Spooks went about clearing their name, learning the whole Haunter Spooks scandal was a deliberate setup by one of the Haunter Guild's founders called Despair, a group of of Dolliber spooks alongside the artificers who essentially tortured him, beating the individual to his corpus turned to vapor and melted what was left at a soul forge and wrapped it around his face to melt down Despair's eyes. It took 6 days for Despair to enter his harrowing. Truly horribly delighting stuff, don't you think? These Dolliber would form their own faction, the Harrowsmiths, making 3 leagues 4. When the Haunters learned what happened, losing such a powerful wraith in their number, they realized the spooks could indeed look after themselves and made a public apology to them in front of the other guilds, signing a truce and becoming allies once more. The spooks got on by, if only just fulfilling various roles during the War of the Guilds, still lacking a greater organization, and the Artificers' unanimous victory didn't really change much within the Spooks Guild. They carried their alliance with the Artificers and Haunters, whilst Ned Riddle and his opposite numbers, Francesco de Cossacano of the Nephians, Aristide Plummet of the Harrowsmiths, and Herman Reinhardt of the Dolliber, formed the Commission, the governing body of the Spooks Guild. When stricter enforcement of the Dictum Mortem began rolling out, the Spooks had to set up the role that the Monitors provided with Lifeweb, as they, the Monitors, withdrew from their services, which is one of the reasons why the Spooks do not like the Monitors as much as the Monitors do the Spooks. The Spooks, particularly a group of Dolliber called Reinhardt's Raiders, decided to fight back during the first abomination, where renegades invaded the Onyx Tower by tracking their movements, essentially offering them up on a silver platter. This and the following decades would cause the guild to split, as one side dabbled with politics and the others who did not want involvement with the Artificers' war against the hierarchy. Riddle, his Dullians and Toscano supported the idea, whilst Reinhardt and Plummet did not, going straight to the Artificers to warn them of the Haunters, Fishers, and Riddle's mini-revolt. Chances are the spooks would not exist today had this mini-betrayal occurred. In essence, the spooks fought each other as well as the hierarchy, the latter decimating a large portion of the Dullians. Whilst many within the guild wanted them gone, removing them would remove the essence of the guild. It was agreed that they, and the guild as a whole, would get to rework under stricter measures. The league got a new name, the Lifeliners. As for Riddle and his allies, no one knows, though many assume the guild handed them over to the hierarchy. They are not the only faction that had a name change, you know, and we haven't exactly talked about what they really do, only in brief passing. Well, let us look at that now. At the top is the Commission of 5, an elected body that sets policy and regulates conflicts within the guild. Commissioners come from the 99 bosses, who oversee regional activities. The Commission, or the C5 as they are occasionally called, oversee a further 5. You have the Lifeliners, previously the Dullians, the ones who presented the guild's cause, which we will cover later, and staged the coup within the Haunters Guild to break away. They have a huge reputation and power within the guild's overall structure, and rarely request help from the spooks outside of their clique, following their own code of conduct. These are the wraiths you go to when you are in need of having a feta protected, whether it involves having it put into a museum for safekeeping, or breaking down the shroud and dealing with the assailant however they deem appropriate. The Memento Morians, or the Nephians, using the original name, are the Paphos runners that collect emotions of quick en masse. This faction congregates around places where those who have died are remembered: cemeteries, battlefields, street corners, and so forth. The strong, mournful emotions are distilled into liquid Paphos, which is bottled in a special Paphos flask and shipped for those willing to pay. This process often requires a bit of encouraging, if you get my meaning, which is a blatant breach of the Dictum Mortem. Probably the closest real-world example I can think of are the Prohibition rum runners and the illegal liquor trades that happened during those times. The Dollar Bra, or the Shroud Breakers, if we are to use the more modern name, have a long history within the guild, dating back to the War of the Guilds. They worked closely with the Haunters and other shroud-crossing guilds to sanitize structures of the quick in order to demolish haunts, tamper with shroud thickness, or create relics. Over the centuries, they have continued with this work, focusing on ghost hunters and exorcists aplenty. The penultimate faction are the Harrowsmiths, that are the inverse of the Lifeliners. Spooks have destroyed fetters and obliterated a soul on more than one occasion, but the Harrowsmiths specialise and love their work, perhaps a little too much, believing anyone who betrays the guild should be eradicated. Whether it's through oblivion or slow, painful torture, they are masters of pain and are said to be the closest thing a spectre most wraiths will meet, which is part of the reason the Commissioner 5 looks down so heavily on this faction. One tactic they adopt frequently is to beat the victim away to the point of delirium and hallucination, staging a forks-harrowing beating psychologically at the victim until they give up their fellow conspirators against the guild or cough up the payment or fall into a destruction harrowing and is sucked into oblivion. They don't really care what happens, they just want the info. Now throughout this conversation, I've been constantly referring to the Commissioner 5, but I've only mentioned 4 factions thus far. Well, that is because the 5th and final one hasn't really played much of a part of the guild's old history, and this is a group called the Grey Gangs, which is made up of wraiths of the modern industrial era. Gangsters, labour unions, and other such groups like organisers, legmen, and strike breakers, and are responsible for most of the smash and stab work of the spooks within Necropoli. They provide muscle for hire to the highest bidder, regardless of loyalty. Many also serve as a good substitute for someone to turn to if you don't trust the authority but don't expect them to be nice about it. The Grey Gangs came about during the founding of the first Necropoli, London, which was ruled by a gang of spooks called Locals that would push the guild into a more modern era, restructuring the guild to emulate the then gang culture of the US and UK, where all the orders come from the top, which tends to throw off hierarchy investigators. There are no meetings or conferences amongst leaders, nor do their ranks have the usual traditional naming schemes one can find in the other guilds. The grunts and hired muscle of the guild are the Defenders, set in tightly knot squads of 10 and deal with group work like riots, sanitizing, and other spook practices, and are led by a captain called an Armada, which I suppose is a spook tutor. If they, the Defenders, have proven dependable, they are allowed to work on their own to deal with a client, though this is rarely the simple take of obliterating a target. They are called Defenders from the pledge they take to defend the connection to the skinlands of any and all wraiths who need their help, including their own squad mates. They swear an oath to protect the fetter of one of their squad, even if it means sacrificing them to oblivion. As well as the commanding Defenders, Armadas take on solo tasks from their superiors. Their name alone comes from the Latin phrase armadere, meaning to knight someone, but they are not noble. They have killed before in the name of the cause. They have a bit more than the freedom than the Defenders, but have more responsibility overseeing their own turf in the Necropoli, keeping all intruders out. The ones overseeing, coordinating, and meditating disputes between the locals and the Necropoli are controllers. They are similar to the Armadas, but have more turfs across the Stygian Empire and have been around for centuries. A large group of locals called a combination that is overseen by a boss, who is elected by the controller of all the locals under the jurisdiction of a single combination and acts as a regional leader and representative to other combinations and the guild's governing body, the Commission of 5. They have the final say on anything you do or request. They are currently 99 bosses, which we discussed already. That is indeed a lot of big cheeses, a lot to give most people a run for their money. Not the hierarchy though, who still tries to enforce the dictum mortem when they can. The spooks believe that the hierarchy are actively harming the Shadowlands by doing this, making things more desperate for wraiths to communicate with the Skinlands, drumming up all sorts of emotions that feed the shadow, increasing spectre numbers and making oblivion stronger by the day. Whilst the structure of the hierarchy is an irritation to the spooks, the lack of organisation of the renegades is just as annoying for them too. They don't believe the renegades don't have much to offer for society, though their usefulness as scapegoats does probably help the guild out in one way or another. On the flip side, they don't care much for their heretics, letting them hide in their numbers if they're hunted and giving them favours as and when needed. The inverse is also true. As for the guilds, it is mostly an individual basis with a few exceptions. They are still close to the artificers and the haunters. Grey gangsters provide muscle for the oracle gamblers, and harbingers employ lifeliners to look after their fetters when they traverse the tempest. The monitors, however, are particularly loathed among the spooks for their tendencies to indiscriminately destroy other wraiths' fetters, and for their snobbish attitude regarding those without lifeweb, and how they are inherently worse than the spooks in terms of their overall practices. Fascinating, isn't it? Up until now, I have led you to believe the spooks are criminals, which they are. They are deemed as one of the criminal guilds because of their practices and their gang-like structure and culture, but you can see that there is a lot of honour in what they do. When most would paint them as nothing more than rowdy rapscallions, they are more the noble knights with equally noble causes. They just have a more anti-hero approach to their line of work, if I were to be so polite about it for a moment. And speaking of causes, we haven't really touched upon all that much what is the cause, which I've mentioned a couple of times but haven't gotten round to explaining, which I'm dreadfully apologetic for, but here we are, I suppose. It's the singular nature that drives the guild forward, the belief that the things of the Skinlands that keep a wraith functioning and enable them to pursue transcendence, fetters, haunts, the memories of living, etc., should be defended against oblivion. The cause is what drives the spooks to protect fetters and keep wraiths from being harrowed or becoming spectres. Spooks who violate the cause, with the exception of the Harrowsmiths, are usually ostracized or hunted down. They act pushing themselves into the Skinlands and working to save the few things that wraiths can still call their own. They protect their fetters and their memories. By doing so, they project the concept of hope. This is the cause, dear explorer. Their cause. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.